Hello, I'm Jeffrey Taxman, and I know working in the emergency department can be stressful much of the time. But with COVID-19, there are particularly strong and difficult stresses and pressures that may be affecting all of you. I hope this presentation will be helpful in that regard. Today, I will be discussing with you the impact of massive community trauma on communities and the EM staff from a psychological and psychodynamic perspective. I'll be drawing on clinical material from disasters I have been involved with, ranging from 9/11 to the earthquakes of Chengdu and Nepal and the tsunami in Sri Lanka. This is a photo of a surgical team I was embedded with in Haiti. The surgical suite, as it was a converted storeroom. And down in the lower left is the only ventilator in all of that city. The goals for today will be to gain an understanding in the psychological impact of a disaster on a community. The reason that's important for ED staff is community is not just a city. It can be the EM team, it can be the ED, it can be the hospital. We'll want to be able to recognize the special stresses of ED physicians and staff during a disaster and strategies for caring for staff and other responders during and after a disaster. So communities are social structures, and as we know, all life is organized into increasingly complex structures. These structures are endothermic, that is, they take energy and work to maintain their integrity, function, and purpose. And we as individuals aggregate into ever-widening structured groups maintained to allow and maximize the both individual and social functioning of the individuals in the group. Some of these social structures are concrete, like families, schools, communities, tribes, states, the ED, the hospital, and some are conceptual. Trauma applied to these complex structures can lead to the breakdown of the structure's integrity and the failure of their function. And this can occur at all levels of human organization, both as individuals and communities. So stress, as we all know, is a pressure or tension exerted on a structure that disturbs its equilibrium. Most organisms and community groups have mechanisms to regain equilibrium when stressed. A trauma is a stress or pressure that overwhelms that regulatory ability to function and to restore the equilibrium. So I define a disaster as a trauma that occurs at the level of the community, and it overwhelms the social and political fabric and the resources of the community. A disaster threatens the safety and disrupts the function of the community and the individuals in it. Again, I would be thinking in terms of the community at large that you're serving, but also the smaller community within that of your own medical group or the ED. There's different types of disasters. I'm sure you're familiar with most of them. Natural, human-made, and willful human acts. The reason the distinctions can be important is when there are natural disasters, like floods, earthquakes, or even some of the human-made accidents or disasters, we can use our own defenses to distance ourselves from the trauma. We can say, well, I don't live in California or Nepal, so I can empathize, but I'm safe and my community is safe. Even mass shootings, wars, as traumatic as they are, if you're not near them, they won't affect you as severely psychologically. On the other hand, a pandemic affects us all, and we can't use the normal distancing defenses in order to not be as affected internally by the disaster. One of the things that disasters do to those that are involved in them is they can resonate with and activate many old primitive anxieties and fears. Some of this occurs at a collective level, a whole culture or country, and that's usually mediated by either religious or cultural lore that is passed on to members of the group. The history of a culture may include wars, unrest, previous pandemics, or other disasters that have gained control of the cultural focus. It's also significant that massive disasters can reawaken old developmental processes and conflicts that we go through individually. Issues like abandonment, sibling rivalry, the need for independence and autonomy. Those in particular, most healthcare workers prize, especially ED staff feel very strongly about having independence and to be able to make autonomous decisions. Issues we go through at a young age about how to handle shame, guilt, and honor can also get reawoken when massive disaster causes regression. One of the factors that can affect a disaster on individuals and communities is the scope and size of the disaster. The others include a time course and the target of the disaster. The scope and size of a trauma can overwhelm the community's adaptive mechanisms, and it can deplete the critical mass needed for the community's function. You see this on the scale of a community, large community, when a massive earthquake, such as in Haiti, essentially wiped out the infrastructure of Port-au-Prince. That made it very difficult to assist people who had been injured. And the community's adaptive mechanisms, healthcare delivery, potable water, and food were disrupted, which magnified the effect of the earthquake. In our situation, we know all too well that the magnitude of this disaster, COVID-19, has overwhelmed the community's, the medical community's ability to function because it's depleted its resources, such as respirators, other protective equipment, ventilators, and the staff itself in some areas. There's a time course to a disaster, and this becomes important both during and then after the immediate impact. We arbitrarily define the impact phase as the first 24 to 48 hours of the acute phase. That's when the disaster actually hits. The acute phase is from the impact to about 2 months, give or take, after the event. And then the post-acute phase is approximately 2 months and beyond. That can go to a time period of years or longer. Now, this graph, I think, is an important graph to look at because it talks about how individuals and communities respond to disaster and the impact of the disaster. And again, I'd have you think in terms of the general community at large, because you're going to be dealing with them, and yourselves as individuals and your medical group. The y-axis is an arbitrary level of community functioning, and the x-axis is time. So here we have, again, an arbitrary level of functioning of a community pre-disaster. At impact, you see what would be expected, which is the decrease in functioning of the community. That's often because of physical impact in some cases, like an earthquake. It may be because of confusion. The dust is still in the air, literally, as in 9/11. And resources need to be marshaled in order to deal with it. We then see an interesting occurrence, and we're witnessing that now, and you are part of it. And that is the heroic phase. Immediately following the impact, there is an increase in functioning of a community. Communities tighten up, they band together, squabbling usually disappears, people are generous, they're heroic, and they want to do what they can to try to come out of the impact of a disaster. For example, at Ground Zero, store owners would offer first responders water, food, shelter, whatever they needed without charge. Everybody was willing to help the other. If I had a place to stay and you needed one, you could stay with me. But then what happens, and we need to watch for this, is after the honeymoon phase, the heroic phase of community cohesion, there's a period of disillusionment and decreased functioning, actually worse than the impact phase. The community functioning becomes much worse. Why is that? It's because external resources get tight as well as internal resources. People who were willing to share are now thinking, wait, my family needs the water. Wait a minute, I need the face shield and the PPEs. People become concerned for their own safety. People become concerned for the safety of their families. There's a tribalism that can get set up. And you may even see that or feel a pull for that within the hospital system. After that period, there then comes a working through and a coming to terms with the disaster and actually working on long-term reconstruction, which leads to a new normal, which is usually higher level and higher functioning than pre-disaster. That's for a number of reasons. One being the literal reconstruction of the infrastructure. And historically, places like post-war Germany, Japan, other earthquake damaged cities have rebuilt with generationally better equipment and infrastructure. Along the way there, though, there are what we call trigger events or anniversary reactions, things that will remind the community and have them regress functioning because of those reminders. For you, that may occur next winter, next fall, when a regular flu comes through and people start having respiratory illnesses or ARDS. And that may elicit a greater panic within the community and more pressure on you. And within your own selves and your own hospital systems or medical practices, you may begin to feel feelings that you had during this pandemic. And then, of course, we may be on the watch for a return of COVID, which, though it may not be as bad as this one, since many people will have had some level of immunity, it will trigger a lot of the panic that we saw this time. We can talk a little bit more about this graph later. Another thing that can affect the severity of the impact of a disaster is the target of the trauma. And again, this has a real-world, practical infrastructure level of impact. It also impacts psychologically many of the developmental conflicts that both individuals and communities go through. For example, our protectors are often specifically hurt and depleted in a disaster. Why? Because they're the ones that run toward the disaster. Our firefighters, soldiers, police, healthcare, community groups. So for the general community to see the people they turn to for care and protection harmed and potentially depleted is particularly frightening. It also can resonate again with old childhood fears, fears that the parents may not be able to protect them, that they're exposed and can't turn to a stronger other person for help. nurturers. The, again, childhood fears of not being nurtured, not being cared for, not being fed, may be reawoken when a disaster depletes resources, water, food, or hospitals. Or hearing the news day in and day out, people are worried about you and your well-being and whether you will be there to take care of them. And of course, you also have the same concerns. And potentially most devastating to many cultures is when children are the targets. And this can be accidental, like in China, where after the earthquake, they discovered many classrooms where whole schools full of children were killed. Or it can be intentional, like in Beslan, when Chechen rebels specifically targeted and killed many children in a school. Some of the acute reactions that people have during a disaster in general is a stunned, shocked reaction, overwhelmed. They may feel abandoned and there's nobody there to care for them. There's an uncommon, accelerated sense of vulnerability. We're often both listening to and potentially passing on exaggerated rumors or rumors that have no basis in fact. Many workers as well as victims have been experiencing many in the general population as well as disaster workers may experience intense love or altruism, particularly toward their coworkers. And there's also a sense of heroism and increased productivity. The adrenaline kicks in, there's a target to deal with and a foe to defeat, and we may feel very productive. People talk about PTSD after disasters. There is an increased occurrence of PTSD, but PTSD is not just severe stress or feeling overwhelmed by stress. PTSD is a specific diagnostic entity, and it has both psychological and physiologic constructs to it. There's a particular time course to the diagnosis, and it's treated differently than even extreme stress. In a disaster, we tend to see about 30 to 40% occurrence of PTSD in direct victims of the disaster. In rescue workers, there is also PTSD, but that's lower, between 10 and 20%. And in the general population not affected directly, we see anywhere from 1 to 10% PTSD. With those numbers, one also needs to remember that people and communities tend to be very resilient. Special issues for ED staff during disasters. Let's start with who you are. You tend to be a particular type of physician and particular type of person. You have a personality type. You're mostly type A. You're assertive, you're thoughtful, you tend to be very smart, and you are the type that will approach a problem knowing that you can deal with it. You develop a professional persona. You're part of the elite, you're a special breed, and you're proud of what you're capable of doing. These are things that not only help you do your job, but give you the kind of confidence you need to do the type of work you do. You have extensive training and you develop a praxis. The way you do things and the way you approach problems and what you can rely on, both internally and externally, is important and well ingrained in your professional persona and your training. As I've said before, You are very strongly a group of people that cherish autonomy, expect it, and accept responsibility and expect to be treated with respect for that autonomy and responsibility. You can't do your job without it. And you've developed what I call an emotional and intellectual bifurcation. That is, you have strong suits of both. You have your intellectual skills and your emotional resources. You can be compassionate with your patients and your family when needed, but you can also take the other path, leave the emotional side waiting for when it's needed, and focus just on the task at hand, the job that you need to do. All these traits help you do your job and do it at a very high level. Unfortunately, many aspects of the COVID-19 crisis affect these issues directly. Do we need help? We're back to my friends in Haiti. Like many type A people, particularly uniforms, cops, firefighters, soldiers, and also surgeons and ED staff, they tend not to think that they really need a psychiatrist in the way. That's what happened with this team that I was embedded with. The first few days, the surgeons, I think, pleasantly tolerated me and didn't have much to say other than to make jokes. But by the second or third day, I was seeing all of them. They were near despondent. What had been happening is they were doing many amputations for crush injuries, and there was nothing else they could do, and they were doing them well. But by the second or third day, they realized that many of these amputations wouldn't have had to have been done at even the most mediocre hospital in the States. They had no dermatomes. They had nothing that they could do skin grafts with. They couldn't set badly fractured limbs. And they began to believe that they were doing more harm than good, that they were actually condemning these people to living life as beggars and invalids. And they became quite despondent. We needed to be able to talk a bit, reframe, and get them to look at what they were doing, who they were, and the tools they were bringing to save these people's lives. It was very difficult for them to do that by themselves in the midst of the chaos and disaster. So some of the special stresses for ED staff, there are internal and external stresses. Looking at the internal stresses, one of the top ones is the fear of getting sick yourself or dying. Also, the fear of being a vector, bringing the illness to your family. And worrying for colleagues and loved ones. And sustaining a very high level of alertness, which is very similar to what combat veterans have talked to me about when they are in combat or getting ready to go into the field, or they've been told that intelligence has said there's going to be an attack. And they have to maintain a very high level of alertness and readiness, and that they know that somebody's out there that may get them, but they don't know if it's going to happen, when, or where. And they talk about how that can be extremely draining, both psychologically and physically. And that's very similar to the stress that you're under for the last number of weeks. You've been waiting for this enemy to come and attack, but you don't know when or if, and you have to maintain that high level of alertness all the time. Can also end up feeling burned out, and we'll spend a little bit more time on that later. And there may be a number of feelings that you may have toward your coworkers. There may be affection or sympathy. There may also be guilt or shame if you don't feel like you're taking the same load they are, or if you've got vacation time. And there may be anger toward other staff members who either aren't taking it as seriously as you are, or maybe taking more time off than you think they should be. There's also, along with the sustained level of alertness, the anticipatory crisis has been in your head for some time. We've been talking about this avalanche of patients that are coming, the overwhelmed hospital systems, not having enough ventilators, having to make ethical decisions about who lives and who dies. And for most hospital systems and EDs, this hasn't happened. But that level of crisis has been in your heads already, anticipating it. Anxiety about decreased quality of services. Are you concerned about being able to give the same high-level quality of care that you do every day, every shift, when you're out of the room more than you normally are, or you're doing things from a distance, or you may feel that some of your contact with patients have been abbreviated? You may also be concerned because you may not have the resources that you need or the other departments to facilitate some of the care that you would want for those patients. Another internal aspect of dilemma and stress for ED workers is you usually, other than very rare exceptions, feel safe in the ED. It's your kingdom, you know how it works, you know all the safety rules and resources, and you rarely feel a threat from patients. Now, there's a constant reminder and a sense of risk and threat, the donning and doffing, the masks that you have to wear, the multiple masks, the reusing of equipment, the constant sense of fear in the air that you may get sick or critically sick. You've also generally developed part of your professional persona is the confidence approaching any patient. You know, any illness, anywhere, anytime, with any patient. You can handle just about anything that rolls in and at least stabilize them. And you develop a very good sense of sick or not sick. You know when somebody's sick, even if you can't figure out what's behind it. You know when they really need to be admitted. Or you know to keep looking further because, boy, they just look sick. Well, COVID-19 has done away with that in a number of instances. It's a rather strange presentation and pathophysiology that somebody trucking along with a PO2 of 60, 65, may be showing no signs of distress. And you may become worried that you're going to miss something that isn't going to be able to wait until tomorrow. And that you may have somebody that looks well and may not get the chest film, may not see the problem, and send them away. And for many people, you enjoyed being in the ED. As I said before, that was your kingdom. It's where you're the expert. It's where you reign. And now, for many people, they can't wait to get out. Not only their shift, but some may be rethinking whether they want to be an emergency physician. They may be thinking of quitting. They may not do that, but that's rattling around in their minds, and that can also erode their confidence in their professional persona. There are external stresses for all of you, as if that wasn't enough. For many, if not all, there's often pressure from family, either explicit or implicit. Do you have to go back to work? Can't you take a break? Fear that you're going to bring something back to them, and fear for you and your safety. There's pressure from the community, both positive and negative pressure. All the talk about being heroes, well, that feels good, but that's often hard to live up to, especially when you may not be feeling very heroic. And then there's the negative pressures, patients that come in and get turned away because they're not acute, or they want to be tested and there's no reason to, or they're there for something non-COVID related and they're not happy with the service. You may be getting pressure from the hospital system. Again, that may be overt pressure, positive pressure, that is telling you to do things, but it may also be pressure by letting you know that they just can't get the resources that you need to do your job. You have tension and pressure, the kind of combat-like alertness I talked about, full shift. Normally, you're busy during your whole shift. Usually there's time to take a break or two. If there isn't, it's still a different kind of pressure. It isn't this intense fear and combat-like pressure all shift. And unfortunately, it doesn't go away. When you leave the ED, there's often still the pressure you get from the family or watching news or just your worry about everything else COVID related. I also think that you have what I call the ER perspective plus the reverberating circuit. The ER perspective is that you see disasters and traumas up close and personal. For you, people not wearing seat belts or riding motorcycles for that matter is very up close and personal. You see the results. You see developing and end-stage ARDS up close and personal. You see what happens to people in disasters. So you have a particular sensitivity to what can happen. Normally, you can leave the ED and whatever the event was can get buried in the rest of your day. But the reverberating circuit is you then leave the ED and all you hear about on the news and from loved ones, families, friends is COVID-19 related discussions. So it keeps that in the forefront of your mind. Another external stress for you is that you're getting faulty or poor or inaccurate information. You're used to relying on sources that are reliable. You go to well-respected, vetted journals, you have meetings, you share new information, and you can rely on that and incorporate that back into your best practices and into your praxis. Now you're being told things that you know aren't true, like reusing masks or other practices that are not best practices, but you're told to do them anyway. And for those of you that need, understandably, autonomy and respect, a lot of this can be very infantilizing. Pardon the crudeness, but one of my favorite expressions is, don't piss on me and tell me it's raining. If you have bad news for me, tell me. Respect that I'll understand it and I'll help figure out what we can do about it. But don't tell me something that we both know isn't true and expect me to go on and accept it as though it was. And you get a fair amount of that from the government, from the news, and even from some hospital administrations. This is related to changing and even poor, quote, best practices. You're being told to do things that you've been trained for years not to do. That leads to conflict. And you're being asked to do these things without the resources needed to do your job. Oh, and everything else in your life. You still have your rent, your lawn upkeep, your family, the kids, all the other problems and issues and stresses that you've had before COVID-19 aren't taking a break. You have to deal with those as well. For you individually, there are certain risk factors that may make working in a disaster worse. If you've had a recent loss or trauma, that may degrade your ability to do well in a disaster setting. If there's unresolved losses, personal losses or traumas, or other life events that you haven't had a chance to process, having a rigid personality style may make it worse because, as it may seem obvious to you, a disaster situation takes flexibility and it takes the ability to do things without the normal routine. Some things to watch out for in the ED among yourself and your colleagues is an over-involvement or an inability to separate. That's very common. I often will feel that when I'm in the field at a disaster, is it's very hard to leave. There's always more that you feel you could do or should do. The opposite of that is a sense of detachment or feeling cold and uncaring. Now, you wouldn't be there in the first place if that's the way you were. So this is a change from your normal caring and attached sense of approaching your work. Frustration can become overwhelming, and one can just feel overwhelmed in general. You may find yourself crying, and it may not be in public, or it may, especially with a colleague. Stress and continuous anxiety may be something to watch for. I'm sure there are times in acute issues in the ED that you feel anxious or you feel stressed, but that usually drops off in a pattern that you're used to. If it keeps continuing, keep an eye on that. Watch out for increased alcohol, smoking, and drug use. You may not even realize that you're increasing the use of certain substances. Secondary traumatic stress isn't discussed very much, but it is like PTSD, but the stress that you're responding to, the trauma that you're responding to, is not direct exposure, personal exposure to the traumatic event. It's exposure to the other person's traumatic experience. If you see enough in an overwhelming flow of victims of a disaster, it can lead to a secondary traumatic stress to you. I saw that with a number of the soldiers working in the earthquake area of China that had to uncover those schoolrooms or some of the other buildings. Burnout, we use that term pretty loosely, meaning I'm tired, I've had too much stress, but it's a specific condition with extreme mental, emotional, or other physical exhaustion that inhibits your ability to continue working normally. Normally, if you've had a very stressful or difficult shift, by the time you rest or you do something different, you're ready to come back. With burnout, you may feel that your normal sense of involvement and engagement becomes replaced by feeling exhausted, cynical, and indifferent. Your normal patience and compassion may be replaced by frustration, bitterness, anger, and the feeling of enjoying being a part of a greater whole and a greater good and doing the good work may be replaced by feeling alienated and isolated. If you become aware of these changes, or if you see that in one of your colleagues, begin to discuss what's going on and what you can do to get help. Resilience is one of the best features for avoiding being overwhelmed or developing PTSD, especially in disaster workers. It's one of the key areas that therapists use trying to either heighten resilience in people going into these areas or work on regaining it for those that have had significant trauma. And that's a sense of hardiness and optimism, primarily one of the biggest features, and I think you all have pretty strong suits in this, a sense of internal versus external locus of control, a tolerance of ambiguity, a sense of self-awareness, and a sense of altruism. Again, emotional responses that you may be feeling or some of the disaster workers you may be working with: anger, elation, and heroism. Many people get their batteries recharged by working in disasters. Many people suffer a sense of helplessness and inadequacy. Even those working at their highest level may feel inadequate. And there's a reality to that. We'll discuss that a little bit more later. Some may experience survivor guilt, particularly if members of your team have become ill with COVID-19 or something else, and you may feel guilty about being healthy. There can be senses of anhedonia, which is not quite like full-on major depression, but a sense of not feeling enjoyment, not being able to take pleasure in the things you normally do. There may be a feeling of distancing from loved ones. Intimacy may be difficult, or even sexual performance or enjoyment. Common feelings among disaster workers are feeling out of control, and that is a particularly stressful situation for people like yourselves, physicians, emergency room physicians, surgeons, police, firefighters. One may feel lost, even physically, in many disasters, but personally and emotionally and professionally, not feeling comfortable or knowing your way around. There may be a sense of fear or dread, which is uncommon, and you're not used to that. There may be a sense of guilt or shame or a feeling of failure. The sense I talked about before about not being able to do enough, or that you're not good enough. There's a sense of reality to that, because we can never do enough in a disaster. There's always more out there that need our help. When I was at Ground Zero, I was leaving, and I had this overwhelming sense that I needed to call my wife and my secretary and tell them I was going to stay another week because there was so much more to do. And that's because there are, even though I had treated 600-700 people or worked with them, there were hundreds, if not thousands more to work with, but you can't do everything. I also realized that I was engaged in what we call parallel process. I found myself thinking and saying the same things I had heard those workers I was working with say, that they couldn't do enough in the disaster. This is a photo I took in Sri Lanka at an oceanside village that was devastated by the earthquake. And I include it because it's a reminder that the ticket to admission, that is the disaster, isn't always the source of the most stress for the patient or the community. I put this picture up and frequently ask the audience, what do you think the cause of stress to this community was? It's in the picture. And of course, you can see the ocean in the background and the destruction of the tsunami, so people say it was the tsunami. No, actually, it was the .50 caliber machine gun bullets that were riddling the houses and the walls. This village was caught between the Tamil Tiger forces and the Sri Lankan government forces for years in a civil war. And actually, the tsunami was a relief. It got them out of the village, it got them into respite areas, and it got them relief from the war. So that's a reminder to me that even when you're talking to patients or your fellow physicians, it may not be COVID-19 that's the source of their stress and their difficulty. COVID-19 and the constant pressure may be bringing other issues to the fore. So what can we do? Self-care and prevention. If you're in the field or you're going into a disaster area, you need to prepare ahead of time, if possible, and know what your expected duties, roles, and risks are, and what is in your wheelhouse, what you're capable of, and what your limitations are. Now, that's particularly important in the field, but in the ED, you may be getting asked to do things that you're not prepared to do, but feel because of the emergent situation that you need to do them. Importantly, when there's a disaster or sustained tension and stress, it's helpful to work in pairs. I try my best not to go into a disaster zone without a buddy or a pair so that we can keep an eye on each other. And if you have a colleague when you're working, it may be nice to engage in how each other are doing or to observe how each other are doing. Your HR group may have a buddy system. A number of hospitals are doing that, where they pair docs and nurses up to be able to check in with each other. While this may seem obvious, it's important to eat regularly and healthy and to rest the best you can. Try to exercise and do something for enjoyment that you have been putting off in your free time. If you're in the field, limit yourself to 12 to 14 hours of work and rotate in and out of hot zones in shifts. Try to keep to a regular schedule. I know your schedules are not regular, but you do have the advantage of having them scheduled usually weeks to months in advance, and you can use that to prepare yourself. Exercise, eat well, keep hydrated, get rest when you can, and take breaks. I know during regular times, your shifts are often without breaks, even biological ones. But during the COVID crisis, you can and should be able to take at least a 10-minute break. Get out of the PPE, take a break, rest your mind, get something to drink, maybe chat with a colleague. This may be a good place for collaboration with administration to figure out how to do that and keep the ED running smoothly. Pay attention and keep in contact with loved ones, and talk to colleagues or supervisors about your work and your feelings and how you're feeling during the shift and about what's going on in the disaster in general. I think it's very important to limit the public news and media. As I said before, you're used to good sources of information, and right now, especially for ED staff, the news media becomes an echo chamber and often has stressful information that may not be accurate. Have periodic self-assessments. Watch out for burnout or depression or stress in yourself and colleagues. Take the time to literally say, how am I doing? And check some of the things that I talked about before. Be aware of secondary traumatic stress and the kind of symptoms that I mentioned earlier. Be aware of whether you start feeling inadequate or like you can't do enough, or that you're feeling de-skilled or not good enough. Ask for help when you need it. And know what it is that you need to recharge or refill and make that happen. These are resources. They're articles that have been well vetted. They're for first responders, and some of them, particularly psychiatry.org, has very good resource material for physicians. If you're thinking that you would benefit from counseling or talking with somebody, you can use your own contacts, the doc network. You know somebody that knows somebody, and that's often a good referral source. You can talk to your organization's EAP. There's also a disaster distress hotline. A very good resource is the Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress, along with the Green Cross and CISM, have put together a list of vetted counselors that can be reached at this address. They have over 80 screened therapists who have been screened for previous experience in working with first responders in disasters. And you'll find that it comes up with all these names listed like I have shown here, shows the days the person's available, the times, the time zone, and particularly what their specialty is and who they've worked with in the past. So in conclusion, it's important to take care of yourselves. And one of the first ways to do that is to remember who you are and what you're doing. And I came across a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote that reminds me of you and the work you're doing. He said, "To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived, that is to have succeeded." I think that encapsulates you and what you do. So remember who you are and why you do this, and take care of yourselves. I wish you all well, and I hope you take care of yourselves and continue to do the fine work that you do. Thank you. You may feel free to contact me if you would like any further information or if I can be of further service. Thanks again.